Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 5th. Today we're going to delve into the harrowing case of Julie and Robin Kerry, two sisters whose lives were tragically cut short on this day in 1991 in an event that shook the city of St. Louis, Missouri. In this episode, we're going to tell the story of Julie and Robin Kerry, two young women who are full of promise, creativity, and compassion. Let's get started. Julie was the older sister, and she was just 20 years old in 1991. She was the kind of person you describe as effortlessly artistic. She was a college student, a poet, and someone who genuinely wanted to use her talent to make the world just a little bit better. Robin, at 19, was equally remarkable. She was known for her intellect and her drive. She was also very kind. She cared deeply about social justice and dreamed of building a career where she could help others. On April 4th, 1991, the sisters invited their cousin, Thomas Cummins, who was visiting from out of town, to join them on a visit to Chain of Rocks Bridge. And this wasn't just any local landmark to them. Julie had actually etched some of her poetry there, and she wanted to share it with Thomas. Now, Julie and Robin were not the type of young women who are going to seek out danger. They were careful, they were grounded, and that evening was supposed to be about family, about showing her poetry to her cousin. They were going to go to a place that they loved and maybe watch the river as the sun went down. But tragically, what should have been a peaceful night between family turned into the start of one of the most heartbreaking and haunting crimes that St. Louis has ever seen. Chain of Rocks Bridge had once carried travelers along the iconic Route 66, but it had been closed to vehicle for years. However, it was still open to pedestrians so that you could walk on it and enjoy the panoramic views of the Mississippi River. As the trio strolled along the aging bridge, the night seemed calm. The cool air, the sounds of the rivers below, and the company of family made it feel like a simple, peaceful outing. But that quiet night took a sinister turn when they crossed paths with four young men: Marlon Gray, Reginald Clemens, Antonio Richardson, and Daniel Winfrey. At first, it was a chance encounter. The two groups exchanged brief greetings, and nothing was there that would suggest what was about to unfold. But unbeknownst to the Kerry sisters and Thomas, these men had already been discussing robbing somebody that night. Julie, Robin, and Thomas continued walking, completely unaware that the group of men had regrouped and decided to follow them. Suddenly, the calm of the evening was shattered. The attackers cornered the trio. Thomas was quickly subdued and forced to the ground, while the sisters were separated and subjected to unimaginable violence and sexual assault. But the horror didn't stop there. Once the assaults ended, the attackers led Julie, Robin, and Thomas to a manhole cover on the bridge's surface. The cover opened to a narrow platform suspended high above the Mississippi River. One by one, they were forced through the opening. Thomas, under orders and fearing for his life, was told to jump. He did, and by some miracle, he survived the 70-foot fall and managed to fight the cold and the currents to reach the riverbank. Julie and Robin weren't given the same chance. Both were pushed into the river and were swept away by the dark, frigid waters. The men fled the scene convinced that they had erased all of the witnesses. Even though he was battered and traumatized, Thomas somehow managed to go find help. His report set into motion a massive investigation. For the Kerry family, it was the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare as they clung to hope, praying that somehow their beloved daughters might be found alive. But tragically, Julie's body was recovered weeks later, while Robin's remains were never found. Officers from both the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department and St. Louis County Police knew immediately that they were dealing with a high-stakes capital murder case. Thomas's description of the attackers helped them quickly narrow their focus. Within days, they brought in Daniel Winfrey, who was just 15 years old at the time. Winfrey, scared and overwhelmed, cracked under the pressure. He confessed to his role in the crime and pointed the finger directly at Marlon Gray, Reginald Clemens, and Antonio Richardson as the ringleaders. According to Winfrey, the original plan had been to rob the trio, but things escalated horrifically into sexual assault and ultimately murder. Winfrey's confession was graphic and detailed. He explained how Gray had orchestrated the attack, how the sisters and Thomas were forced onto the bridge's catwalk through a manhole, and how Gray encouraged the others to push them into the river. Winfrey admitted that while he hadn't physically pushed anyone himself, he stood by and did nothing to stop it. Armed with this damning confession, detectives arrested Gray, Clemens, and Richardson. Both Clemens and Richardson initially confessed during their interrogations and acknowledged their involvement. However, they would later claim that their confessions were coerced, an argument that would ignite legal battles and public debate for years to come. Still, investigators found evidence that supported Winfrey's statement. Items belonging to Julie and Robin were recovered both near the bridge and in the possession of the suspects. And the forensic evidence of the violent struggle lined up with what Thomas and Winfrey had described. Investigators also found clothing and other personal belongings that the suspects had hastily discarded in the hours after the attack. There were also eyewitnesses. Several people reported seeing the suspects on the bridge that night, reinforcing the timeline that the police had built. Between the confessions, the forensic findings, and the witness statements, the case against the young men appeared to be solid. For the Kerry family, the arrests brought a small measure of relief, but they also ushered in what would become a long and painful legal process. The trials of Marlon Gray, Reginald Clemens, Antonio Richardson, and Daniel Winfrey gripped the St. Louis community. Not just because of the horrific nature of the crime, but because of the difficult legal and moral issues that it raised. Each of the four faced severe charges: first-degree murder, robbery, rape, and armed criminal action. In a plea deal with prosecutors, Daniel Winfrey, just 15 years old, agreed to testify truthfully against the others in exchange for reduced charges. He ultimately pled guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action and received a 30-year prison sentence. In his courtroom testimony, he painted Marlon Gray as the driving force behind that night's violence, the one who encouraged the group to commit the assaults and later push Julie and Robin off the bridge. Marlon Gray went to trial in 1993. Prosecutors argued that Gray had masterminded the robbery and assaults and then ordered the sisters' murderers to eliminate any witnesses. The case relied heavily on the testimony of Thomas Cummins, who had survived the attack, as well as Winfrey's confession and testimony. The jury deliberated and ultimately found Gray guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. Throughout the proceedings and even up to his execution, Gray maintained his innocence, claiming that he was not present when the murders occurred. Reginald Clemens faced a separate trial and also stood accused of 2 counts of first-degree murder. His initial confession to police was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, although Clemens would later argue that it had been coerced. Despite his recantation, the evidence against him, including his own statements, witness testimony, and corroborating details, led to a conviction and a death sentence. His trial and subsequent appeals became the center of years-long legal debates, with concerns raised about potential police misconduct and racial bias. Antonio Richardson, only 16 years old at the time of the crime, was also convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and also received a death sentence. However, in 2003, the Missouri Supreme Court reduced his sentence to life without parole, citing both his young age and his intellectual limitations as mitigating factors. Richardson's defense portrayed him as someone who had been heavily influenced by the older defendants rather than someone who was the primary driver of the crimes. Now, all of the trials were fraught with controversy. Defense attorneys for both Gray and Clemens argued that their clients had been pressured into confessing and that the state leaned too heavily on Winfrey's testimony, given his clear incentive to cooperate. There were also the racial dynamics. 4 Black defendants accused of murdering 2 white victims. This drew national scrutiny, with civil rights groups questioning whether or not the defendants received fair trials. For years, the conviction stood. However, in 2015, the Missouri Supreme Court overturned Reginald Clemens' conviction, citing prosecutorial misconduct and concerns about the voluntariness of his confession. In 2017, Clemens entered an Alford plea to reduced charges. This meant that he did not admit guilt, but did acknowledge that there was enough evidence for a conviction. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Marlon Gray was executed in 2005 via lethal injection while still maintaining his innocence. Daniel Winfrey, after serving 23 years, was released on parole in 2015. Antonia Richardson remains incarcerated, serving life without parole. This case has since become a key point of reference in discussions about juvenile justice, death penalty appeals, and confessions that were given under duress. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!